Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I am glad to have you all here with me today. And what a week it has been. So today I'm going to approach things a little bit differently because I'm not intending to do this very often. But first, a little bit of shameless self-promotion. My second book, Hapless Homesteader, is now available on Amazon. I would encourage anybody who wants to criticize or look at my own work to pick it up. I currently have it at a discounted rate of 99 cents for the Kindle version. And if you have already read it as I was writing my weekly series, or if you've picked it up, I would encourage you to please leave me a review. They really, really help independent authors like myself. And with that being said, this week we are reviewing kind of a soft spot for me. It's one of my go-to genres, and I don't pick it up very often because of what's happened this week. We're going to be reviewing Jobless Reincarnation, and I'm sorry, but I'm not even going to try to pronounce the author's name. It will be linked down in the description. This is a mainstream light novel series, at least what I'll be reviewing today. It was popular enough to be made into both a manga and an anime, and I do encourage you to check out either one. I find the story very, very enjoyable. Otherwise, I would not have spent the last week becoming current on a book series that has 22 entries, 19 of which are currently available. So like always, we are going to start with a story recap, but unlike always, since I have read this series to its current point and there are currently 19 books available, I will be dividing my likes and dislikes into non-spoiler and spoiler. And at the end, after I give my thoughts on the series, I want to give my thoughts on the genre as well, because I think it would be something nice to cover. So let's begin with our story recap, and this is going to be a little bit longer due to the nature of the series itself. And since this is already a show that's out, you can go check it out. This will cover about half of the first season of the show and about the first book and a half, maybe 2 books. And I'm going to be vague for the purposes of not triggering any kind of copyright. I would prefer that anybody who wants to make their own opinions of this would go pick up their own copies and give it a read. So let's begin. After missing his parents' funeral, our main character, who has been a shut-in for nearly 20 years, is kicked out of his house by his brothers and sisters who have basically become sick of his crap. Sometime around his middle school career, he came home and just simply never left his room, becoming a shut-in and basically a burden on the rest of his family, becoming rather obnoxious in the process if what he says about himself is to be believed. After effectively becoming homeless, he's wandering the streets wondering how he's going to make it in life when he notices a couple of students arguing in a crosswalk or on a street corner. It's not entirely clear. He also notices a truck coming their way because this is typical Isekai. However, unlike typical Isekai, after pushing the girl out of the way, he is not only knocked up against a concrete wall by the truck, but the truck, having some follow-through, decides to squish him like a tomato and finish the job right and proper. A rather brutal way to die, and I have to say that Isekai truck, which has been flying around sending people to other worlds, was particularly unmerciful in this case. However, this is not the end of the main character story, as most of you probably already guessed. He wakes up somewhere else, not entirely knowing where he is, rather in pain and incapacitated, only really able to move his arms. And he starts to spot other people around him that he notices don't look Japanese and don't seem to be speaking a language he's familiar with. It doesn't take him long to realize that he has been reborn into another world to parents known as Paul and Zenith. As a baby, the main character, who is now named Rudius, because we do not get his first name, and for the rest of this review be referring to as Rudy, is a very odd child. He didn't cry when he was born, and he doesn't cry when he gets hurt. He also started crawling and moving around much faster than other children, and if they turn their back on him for a second, he simply disappears, requiring him to be tracked down even before he is 1 year old, crawling around the house and disappearing on the family members. It especially creeps out the maid Lilia, who is also partially a caretaker for Rudy, but Rudy is an incorrigible pervert and has always been so, even before he died. Around the age of 2, Rudy learns to read by basically having his father read him storybooks and just following along. He attributes this mostly to the fact that not only does he retain his memories from his previous life, his brain as a child is much more capable of absorbing information. And so by the age of 2, he goes into his father's study, which is a generous name for a room that contains a desk and 5 books, and basically gets into his parents' old adventuring stuff, finding a handbook of magic. Using this, he determines that he's going to start trying to learn some of the magic. It doesn't take him long to figure out how the magic system in this world works, basically by series of magic circles and incantations. However, shortly after beginning to practice with the incantation and focusing purely on how they make him feel when he casts, he finds out that he doesn't actually have to use the incantations himself. However, shortly after casting 3 spells, he passes out, making it look as if he's wet himself. Being a little worried about some of the things he reads in this manual of magic, he believes that maybe his magic reservoir is capped. However, he quickly discovers the more he uses his magic, the more he can use his magic. And so over the next year, he spends his time casting spells in order to increase the maximum number of spells he can cast. Until one day, after practicing beginning magic, he decides to try an intermediate spell. And he promptly blasts a hole through the wall of the study. This being a 3-year-old at this point, mind you. His mother, being particularly excited because she herself was a mage in her adventuring days, declares that they have to hire him a tutor, something which his father is vehemently opposed to, but as typically happens, there was a compromise reached, and Rudy will now be learning magic as well as swordsmanship, to appease both of his parents. Rather a strange thing to try to teach a 3-year-old, but this is based on a medieval-style society. Children started young. His new tutor is a demon girl with blue hair named Roxy, much to the surprise of both his parents and himself. And without getting too much into the perversions of Japanese writing, she starts to teach him about how to use magic of more advanced skills and tiers. By the time he's 5 years old, he finally achieves peer with his master, being able to cast the final level of spell that she can cast, that is Saint tier. And much sadness ensues as she tells him there is no more she can teach him and decides to leave. However, this was a special event for Rudy in general, and I want to cover this because a lot of the complaints that the main character has is that he's been a shut-in for at least 20 years before he was reborn into this world. He has developed a fear of leaving outside the borders of the home, and it's Roxy who eventually drags him out. And for this, he swears basically an eternal debt to his teacher. Shortly after Roxy leaves, Rudy decides he's going to actually go out into the village and play and explore, where he meets what he believes to be a young boy named Sylph. Sylph is a quarter-elf child. So Sylph has pointed ears and green hair. The green hair is more of an important thing later, but that should be covered again later. After some bonding, Sylph convinces Rudy to start teaching him magic, which Rudy promptly does. And the two continue to bond for a few more years until one day, while teaching Sylph magic, it starts to rain. So both of them run back to his house in order to basically get out of the rain, protect the book Rudy is carrying, and get themselves cleaned up. Rudy, being a young boy and this being a sort of medieval society, tries to convince Sylph to take a bath with him. Unfortunately, it's during this time and his forceful undressing of his friend that he finds out that Sylph is not a boy. Sylph is actually named Sylphiette and is a girl. After some prodding from his father to apologize for what his father thought was him being a promiscuous young boy, and is shocked to find out that his son thought his friend was a boy, there's an awkward little session where they make up and continue on as friends. However, after about another year, and my time frame is a little messed up because I have seen both the show, read the book, and read the manga, Rudy decides that he's plateaued on what he can learn in magic, and after a letter from his teacher, decides to attend a university for magic that was suggested to him by his teacher. Sylphie, however, is not happy about it and tries to force him to stay. So Rudy approaches his father and asks if he could possibly pay for both him and Sylphie's enrollment in this university. His father flat out refuses on the grounds that it would be far too expensive, and so Rudy himself asks if it would be possible for him to get a job in order to pay for both his and Sylphie's tuition. His father says he'll find out what he can do, and very promptly after, a former colleague of his father named Ghislaine shows up, and it's rather funny that by this point his father has realized that Rudy is smarter than him, so instead of trying to reason with his son, simply knocks him out and throws him into the back of a carriage, giving him a letter explaining the situation. Rudy has been employed to be the tutor of a noble girl as well as Ghislaine, so that he can teach them not only basic tier magic, but reading and writing and arithmetic. It is upon meeting the girl he is supposed to train, who is named Eris, that he finds out that she is basically a violent little monster, and refuses to be taught anything by anyone for any reason. After a savage beatdown where she, I believe, is 10 and he is 7, he eventually concocts a plan with the help of Eris's father to stage a kidnapping. However, an actual kidnapping occurs, and it's during the process of trying to return Eris home that the two form a kind of mutual respect, and Eris allows Rudy to become her tutor. And we spend some time learning Rudius's growth as he tries to teach this girl who frequently and savagely beats him up, but he slowly starts to gain her and her bodyguard's respect as he's tutoring them both and teaching them magic, to the point that they actually develop a friendship. And so one day Rudy decides that he wants to show his new friends the highest tier of magic that he has learned, which is a Saint tier water spell. However, something odd goes on in the sky, and a cascade magical effect goes off, basically sending everyone in the entire region to different parts of the world. And this is where Rudius first meets the man god. Now, I'm going to stop with the recap there because I believe that will bring you to about the middle, if not the end, of the second book. This is currently a 22-book series, and I was rather vague. There's a lot of stuff I didn't cover, but again, I don't want to give away the whole story. Let's first get into the non-spoilers of the things that I liked. First of all, I really like that this series is a slow trek through Rudy's life. You get to see as he slowly develops and slowly changes from the person he was in our world to the person he is in this world. He has made a decision that he is not going to be the same layabout that he was back then and change virtually everything about himself. And he has rather a rough time of it, but he does remain persistent. Also, despite being a prodigy and being very, very powerful even in later series, he is frequently outclassed by other people. He is not the most powerful person in the world, and he is frequently and often disturbingly put into his place and reminded of just how fragile life can be. I also like the character work in this series. Now, manga and light novels and a lot of stuff that Japan tends to put out has a problem with characters being a little bit shallow, if not entirely shallow. But the characters in this, while occasionally being very shallow and slightly one-dimensional, feel deep enough. They feel not only different from each other, but they have their own wants, their own desires, and their own ways that Rudy has to find to interact with them in order to get them to not only get along, but in order to get them to do what he wants. One of my biggest things that I like about this is the magic system. I like a good magic system, as I have stated many, many times. This one isn't as dark as some others. The magic system in this is simultaneously hard and soft. There are hard rules for how to use the magic. Rudy, the main character, is diving into the more esoteric aspects of the magic. He can approach it in ways other people wouldn't think of because he's from another world. He has a different perspective on it, and so therefore he will often do things that other people find either incredible or worrying, or both. Also, I like the fact that there are not a lot of video game references in this story, at least as far as other characters go. Any references to pop culture of our world or video games of our world are purely done as a comparison by the main character when he's trying to find out how something works or why something works. No other character mentions anything about that. That is a very good saving grace because a lot of other series in the genre don't do that. Also, and this is a personal taste thing, I know it doesn't really apply to everybody, this has a lot of perverted comedy, and I as a man am inside perpetually 12 years old, so I find it hilarious. Some of it goes a little overboard, but I still find it funny. Now let's get into the non-spoiler dislikes. This series can be overly saccharine at times. There's a lot of emotion, as tends to be standard with a lot of Japanese shows and writings and blah blah blah. I believe this comes from how their society functions, though I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. You can research that yourself if you want to know. Also, despite almost 20 years passing in this world, bringing you to the current book, which I have recently finished, the character is often a little too insecure. I get that he spent the bulk of his time alive, including this life and the last, being what one would define as a loser. However, even after coming very far and achieving what he has achieved by the most recent book, he's often much more insecure than I feel he would need to be about his abilities and what he can do. However, it does give him an air of humility, but sometimes it feels a bit much. So now we're going to get into spoiler territory. And what I cover next is basically going to cover some more hardcore elements of the story and things that might spoil it. So if you would like to read it, go ahead and skip ahead at this point. I will try to figure out how to do a timestamp and put it down at the bottom. So we're going to get into the spoiler of the things that I like. First of all, this series has a fantastic enemy. The man god, being the main antagonist, is simultaneously threatening, understandable, but nebulous. He is not actually present in the world and can only visit people in their dreams, but he has the ability to look into the future of people that he's working with. Oftentimes, he will give people advice that will allow them to trust him until he gives them the final piece of advice that would entirely ruin their lives. And it's not entirely clear why he does this. Now, we do know why he's doing it to the main character. And again, this is a major spoiler. It's because the main character's descendants are going to play a major role in killing the man god, and so the man god wants to continue living. However, it is implied very often that the man god has always followed the same modus operandi, which is messing with people, giving them vague hints, and causing them nothing but distress, and causing them to fail at the things they're trying to do. He is basically a god of mischief and chaos. And he is despised by a number of people in the series who are very powerful, who will attack you if you mention you have any association with this being. His major powers, aside from being unreachable by normal beings, is that 1, people implicitly trust him when he talks to them and appears to them in their dreams. And 2, he can see into the future of anyone he talks to. It is implied later in the series that aside from this being a major strength, it is also a major weakness. It has led this being to being unable to speculate as to what somebody might do if he cannot see their future. But again, this is only a minor spoiler. Well, it's a major spoiler, but it's not so much that it'll ruin the story for you. To the man god, the entire world is one big chessboard which he can manipulate from the outside. He can see the possibilities of how someone's life will go, to the point that he can convince a person to simply go somewhere in order to startle a rat, in order to have the rat get into that person's food and poison the person's wife in order to kill them with a very obscure disease. It makes him both a very difficult enemy to confront, but also a very difficult enemy to find. There are some hard limits on his power. However, that's something more discussed in the books, and I will leave you to read that. Second thing I liked that's spoilerish is I like the main goal of the story. The main character himself is not directly trying to defeat the man god. There is a time in the future, probably long after he's dead, in which his descendants will have to fight this sworn enemy. And so the story seems to be more about setting things into motion that will help lead to the man god's downfall, gathering allies, and finding out different information that would be necessary for long after the main character has died to not only protect his children, but to bring about the downfall of this being. The main character himself is not a threat to the man god, but his descendants are, and so the man god is trying to kill off his descendants, or to prevent them from ever being born in the first place. Again, there are some hard rules to this in the series. Well, I say hard rules. They're kind of vague rules, but they're understandable rules. Also, Rudy's other goals are very understandable. He's simply trying to defend his family from this almost insurmountable enemy. And it's rather hard to understand some of the things he has to go do in order to get these things done, but it does feel believable when he'll go toe-to-toe with some unstoppable force in order to defend his family. Also, I really like the fact that aside from magic in this world, there are curses and there are blessings. And they're simultaneously easy but difficult to understand. And they can affect things as simple as a person's hair color, or be caused by things as simple as a person's hair color. They can be gained or you can be born with them. It makes the system a little bit more fun to play with and gives some of the characters a little bit more depth. But that really comes up in the later stories, so I won't spoil that here. Also, the main character's struggles aren't just from the trauma he experienced in his old life or his terrible habits from his old life. First of all, it turns out that his family in this world is incurably horny. Yes, a terrible problem, I understand. But he's not just gripping with the problems of trauma, he's gripping with the problems of his own new body and his family and their place in the world and his extended family and the politics of this world. He may have had a 30-year head start on developing mentally. However, there's a lot in this world that is different, and since he laid about in his old life, he's not as prepared as he could be. Now let's get into the things I dislike that are spoilers. I hate power armor in fantasy. I don't know when this started, but I don't like it. Now, that won't immediately disqualify me from liking a book, but for some reason, a lot of people who do Isekai want there to be power armor in fantasy when magic armor is perfectly suitable. However, eventually it basically does break down to just basically magic armor. I feel like, however, the trope of power armor in fantasy being a magical power armor is overused. Now, there is a differentiation between armor that is magical and armor that is magical power armor. I'm not going to get into it too much here, but you know it when you see it. However, fortunately in this series, the armor isn't used too much, it doesn't make the character overly powerful, and it is not an ultimate solution to everything. In fact, when he uses it, he often doesn't win anyway. Again, I also want to cover in this side that this story can be overly saccharine at times. There's a lot of emotion in this book, and people have a lot of emotional breakdowns. And it might just be that you're reading only the highlights of this person's life, who by the 20th book, he is roughly 20 years old. So there's a lot of time to have emotional breakdowns. It's one of the problems I found a lot with some of the Japanese stuff is there's just a bit too much emotion. And there are often entire books dedicated to nothing but the main character's home life, which can be interesting, but I feel like there should be a little bit more action at times. However, it is often nice to have a break. Also, there's the problem in this series that some things are a little too predictable. Now, I'm not talking major story elements, though some of them can be. Some items are too conveniently placed. Some equipment is too easily gained. Certain things the main character gives other characters, you know exactly what's going to happen later on with that individual piece of equipment. However, these aren't as often as you would think. It's more of a minor niggle, but it does pull you out of the story. I feel like a lot of these could have probably been implemented better, but it is what it is. And again, I want to mention that some things feel too easy for the main character. A lot of his social interactions can simply be boiled down to he'll make a heartfelt apology, or he'll simply speak from the heart, and that tends to fix the problem. Now, it doesn't fix every problem, especially not with antagonistic characters, but with those that are supposed to be friendly, or that you would hope to be friendly, it usually boils down to that formula. It's not always bad, but it can be a little bit tedious and repetitive. Also, there's a lot of references in this series to other anime, other manga, video games. Some of them are also really obscure, and I'm not exactly full-fledged weeb myself, but some of them I didn't get, and I'm a little deeper into some of this than a lot of people would be. That being said, I didn't have to look it up, because they're just references. They don't really mean very much. I think they're more stage dressing and setup, and the Japanese do tend to write differently than those who would normally write purely in English. So let's get into my thoughts on the series. I really, really like this series, and that should be evident by the fact that there's 19 volumes available, and I got up to current in less than a week, sacrificing sleep and food and almost everything else during that time, and if that doesn't speak to the fact that I enjoyed this series, I don't know what will. I also really appreciate the fact that video game mechanics are simply referenced by the main character as a way for him to gauge the rest of the world. There are no more game mechanics listed in this. Everybody in this fantasy world works by fantasy world mechanics. And some of the mechanics can be a little vague. They're subject to personal power and personal experience. Magic itself is not an end-all be-all, and at points in the book, it goes into things like the military applications of magic. It makes it feel like this is part of the whole world, where they haven't developed medical technology they need because they have healing magic. Things are decidedly medieval, but other things are far more advanced. And the magic system doesn't really slip up that much, so the magic system is certainly interesting. Furthermore, this book is extremely perverted. Now, I'm not going to disparage those wonderful little people called the Japanese. They are delightfully perverted, and they find a wide variety of comedy in it. And there's a lot of comedy to be had. However, if you're touchy on perversion, you're probably going to have a hard time with some of the things in this book. There's a lot of famous internet arguments that I think would come up here. However, I'm not going to cover them because, one, I like keeping my channel, and two, I really don't want to talk about them in public. There are things in this book that did make me uncomfortable, but there's things in a lot of books that make me uncomfortable. I power through them. They're part of the story. They're part of the experience. That's part of the fun of reading. Next is something that's a little bit odd for me because I haven't really read a book that's covered it very much, and I'm not exactly sure how to feel. Now, anybody who's familiar with anime or the Japanese tropes will know typical harem animes and stories tend to be that you have blank slate character A, all these girls want to get with him, blah, 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 blah. This book takes things a little bit differently. First of all, the main character is not so much of a blank slate, but instead of being a harem anime where he has to choose from one of several girls, this guy just marries all the girls he likes. Polygamy was not something I was expecting by the midway point, and not having any experience with polygamy or how it would work, it's simultaneously interesting and hard to relate to. Now, the main character does have struggles with it, where I want to phrase this as properly as I can. He often has good reasons for why he's married to multiple women, but he also has to go through the struggle of getting his other wives to accept the other women he brings into the house. Sometimes it feels a little more easy than it should. In fact, oftentimes it feels a little more easy than it should. But it leads to one of the things I do like about the series is that the morality system in this world is not our morality system. There are multiple different thoughts in this world on polygamy, as in there is a major religion that is a strong proponent of monogamy. It is a cornerstone of their religion, and they are frequently disparaging to others who do not practice this. However, this being a medieval-style world with magic and monsters, it appears that men are dying a lot faster as there are a lot more women in this world than men, so it does make sense that polygamy would be a thing. A lot of the characters are fine with it as they've been exposed to it, and a lot of the characters are very upset about it as they're a member of this religion. I think it's a nice balance, but it was certainly jarring when it first came up. Even by the point you're current on the book, it does feel a little bit odd. Also, it helps make the world feel big, and that's another thing I'd like to talk about. This world feels tremendous. Early in the series, the main character and whatever party he's with has to spend weeks and months traveling from one location to the next. You have to spend a lot of time finding towns, finding different guilds, meeting different people, running into things on the road. A lot of their lives are spent traveling, which makes sense. They don't have cars. The closest thing they have is horse and buggy. Another thing that makes the world feel big is that despite the fact that by the time the main character is 20 and has become considerably powerful and downright astonishing to other people in the world, the threats that he run into regularly put him in his place. He does have a series of successes, but there are still people in this world who are far more powerful than him, and I believe are well utilized. They're often employed by people he has to get near. Politically powerful people are employing physically powerful people. And even these characters feel a bit more fleshed out than I have seen in other stories similar to this one. That being said, after nearly 20 books, I want to mention something about the editing. Now, I normally don't touch on editing very much. I feel very strongly that the enjoyment of the story is much more important. But editing is a lot like cleaning a toilet. You only notice it when it hasn't been done right. And there are frequent spots in this where the editing is less than optimal, where somebody has went to the next paragraph in the middle of a sentence or a word is spelled wrong. Often it's the same word, but this does put it on par with a lot of indie books that I've read, as I notice that a lot of them will have these frequent little mistakes. And I'm noticing this being a problem in even major publications now. It leads me to believe there might be some problems in the editing world. However, it also might just be that now that I'm writing and reading more to perfect my writing, I'm simply noticing these things more, as I wasn't paying as much attention before. But I feel like the further back you go with books, back to before it became something anybody could publish, they felt a lot more refined. Now let's get into my thoughts on Isekai as a genre. Now, Isekai in recent years has become one of my favorite genres. And I don't say that about too many genres. Oftentimes, I just read what I like, and I bounce between several different genres at one time. However, this particular genre, I found myself following more stories than I normally would. And I think I have a very good theory as to why. It seems that most of these stories are geared towards men, and my theory is that they're the equivalent of romance novels for men. Romance novels, if you're a writer, you'll know, are one of the biggest sellers ever. And the typical readers of romance novels tend to be women. They will devour several of them in rapid succession. In fact, if you use Kindle Unlimited and have done your research, you'll find that romance is one of the biggest genres, if not the biggest genre on there, and one of the reasons why Kindle Unlimited is a thing. There are women out there who will simply go from romance book to romance book. They follow about the same process. They follow about the same story. There's not too much differentiation between them. There are different subgenres where some are more innocent, some are not, some are hardcore, some are rather disturbing. But I feel like Isekai is becoming that for men, and basically that means it's wish fulfillment for men. And yes, there are several women who wish they could take what they knew now and go back in time, but I believe that men in their lives, especially in modern life where there's a lot of people disparaging men and saying they don't need men, that men would like to go to a different world, one where they would feel more appreciated, one where they could simply be what they are. And Isekai fills that genre. And a lot of men anymore, and I'm sure a lot of women have noticed, are rapidly becoming gamers and shut-ins and aren't approaching as many women as they used to. I frequently hear, "Where have all the good men gone?" And I simply think it's that a lot of them aren't being fulfilled. And things like the Isekai genre give them that little bit of wish fulfillment. And I think this is why it's become so popular. And the series I've been reading is definitely wish fulfillment. In fact, the 3 series that I read, you can definitely tell they're wish fulfillment. And that's one of the things that can lead to problems with this genre. This is a huge genre. And while it does have its origins in the West, with things like A Yankee in King Arthur's Court and so on, the East seems to have taken this concept and just run with it. They have taken it to almost every angle and extreme they can, and they don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. And when you get a lot of material, oftentimes you're going to get a lot of crap. And I feel that way about a number of Isekai stories I've read. There's a difference between good Isekai and bad Isekai. And I think that has a lot to do with video games and modern anime. There's not as much relatability in some of them as there should be. They tend to focus more on game mechanics, hit points and magic points, experience, and blah, 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 blah. Things that are fine in video games, but are not good in books. Now, that being said, there are exceptions to that rule. I am a big fan of the Overlord series, which is a series of light novels I am probably not going to jump back into anytime soon, because I know it will end up much like with what I just did, where I got to the end of a nearly 20-volume set of books in less than a week. And that leads me to believe that in some ways, I think the Isekai genre is a fad. I'm not sure how it will stand up given how current trends are going. I'm sure it's going to be with us for a while. But I'm wondering if it's simply a generational thing. But that gets too much into politics and world movements and things I really don't want to cover here. I don't want to cover them because this is all entertainment. That's all I want this channel to be about, whether a book series is entertaining, and in this case, whether a genre is entertaining. And I do find this genre very entertaining. And it could be due to a variety of factors in my own life, which I'm not going to cover here. I believe at some point in every man's life, they often will have the thought about, what if I could go back and do things with what I know now? Or what if I could start over this? Or what if I could start over that? It's a very typical human thing to do. And I think it tends to be more typical with men than women. And that leads me to wonder if this genre has staying power. Because generations tend to change one after the other depending upon their circumstances to which they are born in. You can clearly see this with things like moving from Tolkien to Martin in the Game of Thrones series compared to the Lord of the Rings series. Not just in what they cover, but how they're written. People tend to change based on what's available to them. The advent of TV and video games has led people to like more books written more in the style of showing people what's going on, giving them a scene rather than the long narratives that are in older books. I personally like Starship Troopers as a book, but that is a lot of narrative and not so much showing. And Isekai, I believe, is a product of its time. A lot of things are changing, a lot of jobs are disappearing, new jobs are coming up. There's a lot of rapid change in the world, and I think a lot of people want to go to something that's a bit more simple or something that they understand. Which, again, I can understand. That's why I believe Isekai is popular now, but I have doubts about its staying power in the future. Eventually things will stagnate again. The only constant is change, and change itself is not a constant thing. But with all that being said, and my throat being very raw, and my eyes being bloodshot from all the reading I have done in the past week, I'm going to wish you all good luck. Thank you for listening to my review. If you have any books that you would like to hear my take on, please leave them in the description. I do tend to favor indie authors over conventionally published, but I will read whatever I find interesting or whatever captures my fancy. If you would like to read, review, or criticize my own works, I will include a link in the description. Also, please keep the comments civil in the comments section. Also, if you enjoy what I do, please consider giving this video a like, sharing my work, or subscribing to my channel. Thank you.